I think a lot of you were at yesterday's session, so I won't repeat all of the introduction for Jane, other than to say, as a lifelong Quaker, whose family goes back generations as Quakers, and who has worked with and for Quaker organizations, she knows what she's talking about. Yesterday, she talked about the history and core beliefs of Quakerism as a religious practice. And today, she's shifting to decision-making. Now, within a Quaker meeting, decision-making is a religious practice. We refer to it as meeting for worship with attention to business. But that method of doing business translates extremely well to a secular setting, too, where the focus is on making the best possible decision with and for the entire community. I've been a Quaker about half my life now. I've seen a lot of decisions made by voting. I've seen quite a few made by consensus. And one thing I'll say to you, there's a lot more to consensus decision-making than the absence of voting. And my observation is both work really well for easy decisions. It doesn't matter which. But when you have to make decisions that are complicated or where significant values are at play, consensus decision-making takes longer, but you get decisions that last. You don't get factions moving around in the background trying to figure out how to undo it, because they were part of the doing of it. So I think you're going to find what she has to say both interesting and useful.
Thank you, Lee. Good morning, everybody. Good morning. Nice to see you. Nice to see some of you again. I recognize a few faces from yesterday. I'm happy to be here at your beautiful campus in beautiful Lexington. I said yesterday I've never been here before. I've been to lots of parts of Virginia, but never to Lexington. And what a gorgeous, gorgeous area. So I want to respect that we have an hour to do this. This is a subject that we actually give a full day course on. So I'm really just going to be scratching the surface and trying to hit the most essential points. I'm happy as we go through to take short questions, but I want to get through the main points of things and then have time, hopefully have time for questions at the end, or I can stay until about 11:30 if people have more questions they want to talk about when we're done at 11. But I want to be respectful of finishing up at 11. So collaborative decision-making, as Lee said, is a practice that comes out of the Religious Society of Friends. For those of you who weren't here yesterday, just to give you a short, brief reason why I'm talking about this. So I'm the CEO of FSA, Friends Services Alliance. We're the National Association of Senior Living Providers whose roots are in the Quakers. So we provide a number of services to organizations well beyond our membership. We only have 28 member organizations, but every year we provide service to 100 or more organizations. And you would be surprised how many places I have talked about collaborative decision-making, including at a conference, a healthcare conference for Catholic organizations, which that was really interesting to be looking at nuns in their habits and the priests in their garb. And I'm talking about these practices coming out of Quakerism. But collaborative decision-making is something that people are interested in more and more and more, because folks want to be engaged, they want their voices heard, and this is a very specific technique for doing that. Today, what I'm hoping is just to give you a little bit to understand why we do decision-making this way, learn some basics. I'm going to talk about specifically the role of the convener and the role of the participants. There are specific expectations and responsibilities of both the person facilitating the meeting, convening it, and those who are participating in it. So we will talk about both, and we'll talk about some other things as we go along the way. Some key roles and terms we will focus on. So you will hear me use chair, clerk, convener, facilitator. They're all kind of interchangeable. It's the person who's responsible for running the meeting. Participants are those who are part of the decision-making process, but they're not the one leading the process. Informants are people, it's not like, Watergate when you had informants or the criminal justice system, but oftentimes in an organization like Kendall at Lexington, when there's going to be a decision made that impacts the whole community, you're getting information and feedback from a lot of different people. They're giving information that will help to inform what the final decision is, but they're not part of the decision-making body. And we're going to talk about how important it is to be clear around that. And then the informed are those that once the decision is made, they're told what the decision is. And that's not a two-way communication, that's a one-way communication. I'll just say it was a decision that ultimately it was the board's decision. Then it's shared with everybody else in the community what that decision was, but they're being informed. And then some terms, consensus, sense of the group, unity. Again, what I'm referring to is where we get to for a decision. We use the term sense of the meeting when we're doing this in a religious setting or consensus, but because this is a secular setting where you're using this, we may use different terms. We'll talk about speak and release. One of the most difficult things in this whole process, but so important. And that's about when you offer your perspective and your thoughts, it's then released to the group. It's no longer something you're wearing like an article of clothing and clinging to. You have shared it with the group and you release it to the group. And then the practice of standing aside is a specific practice we have when a group is moving towards a decision and a person or persons within the decision-making group don't necessarily agree with where things are heading, but they understand that that's where the energy of more of the group is going. And so we'll talk specifically about standing aside because that's another important practice in this whole thing. So just a little bit of background. This came out of 350 plus years of Quaker decision-making in our houses of worship, our monthly meetings, our quarterly meetings, the structure of Quakerism. It's really based in those principles of equality, of the spark of the divine in everyone I talked about yesterday. Everybody has something that may have something to contribute to, whether it's just information or whether it's part of the decision, but this idea of equality, and then especially community, and the value of we make decisions together that are good for the whole, not just for me personally. There was also the recognition that a participatory process versus just Robert's Rules of Order or some other voting process where, okay, here's what we need to decide. We have 5 minutes to discuss it. 5 minutes is up, let's call for a vote. And it hasn't been thoroughly explored. So that participatory piece is very important. And right here in the middle is absolutely key, that one of the foundational pieces of all this is that one of our goals is to stay in relationship. That we're going to get to a decision. We may not all fully agree, but we want to stay in relationship and build community as we're doing this. The expression you heard from me yesterday a lot, and it applies so much to this, is it's about the we, it's not about the me. We're making a decision that's good for the whole, however the whole is being defined. All right, I'm going to start with this because this is absolutely critical. With decisions, it is so important to be very clear who's the decision maker, who's accountable for the decision. So when you think about all the different types of decisions that are made at Kendall at Lexington in a day, there are hundreds and hundreds, if not thousands of decisions made in a day about all kinds of different things. And different people, different individuals, different stakeholder groups are involved in those decisions. And having clarity about that, who is the ultimate final decision maker, is really important. And I especially talk about that in a community like Kendall at Lexington, when there are decisions or issues and you're gathering input from the wider community, but the decision actually lies with a smaller group, whether it lies with the leadership team, whether it lies only with the CEO, whether it lies with the board. It's important for people to know who's making that final decision and who's accountable for that decision. So we have these 5 levels of decision making we're talking about. So when we're talking about this practice of collaborative decision making, we're talking about the middle level there. We're making this decision together. This is a group decision. But if it's something that, let's just say again, that the board is going to decide, they're the second to the top there. They may be getting input from a lot of different people, but they're ultimately making the decision. So you see the distinctions here and how important that is? And so I think when you're going through different issues, and Lee had shared with me about the discussions and concerns around the wildlife on the campus and how that was being handled, and how she set up a process for people to be heard and think about what to do. And then the smaller groups were developing recommendations, and then it was going to go to administration. Am I remembering this correctly? And ultimately, administration is going to decide what will be done. So that was, a level 1 or 2 decision there, or level 2, I'm sorry, second from the top. We're getting input, but the decision sits outside of those people who are providing the input. There can be a misconception about collaborative decision-making and in Quaker communities that everybody is involved in every decision and everybody has can have input on every decision. You cannot run a business that way. It just can't happen. So when there are decisions where they're looking for input, there's processes that are set up for people to provide input, and so you need to take advantage of that and find out where it is, when it is, how it is that you're going to be able to bring your voice into giving input on things, but recognize when and when not you are part of the decision-making process. Oops, wrong button, sorry. All right, so yes, collaborative decision-making is a non-voting process, but it's much more beyond that. The people who are involved, the decision makers, are interested in fostering and building community, that sense of community. They need to be committed to hearing the voices and thoughts of others and possibly changing their mind. So we say, if you're part of a decision-making group, so whether it's a committee, or whether it's a board, or whether maybe some of your departments do decisions like this, if you're part of that decision-making group, you need to go into that with an open mind and an open heart. It doesn't mean you don't have an opinion. It doesn't mean you don't have a way you hope things will go. But if you are absolutely married to that, if you are wearing it like it's your winter jacket and you're not taking it off for anything, then you're not really somebody who should be engaged in this collaborative decision-making, because you're not interested in collaborating. And so that has to do with participating, has to do with the convener too. You need to be open to hearing other perspectives and go where the flow takes you. That was one of the most challenging, yet one of the best aspects for me when I took this job at FSA. So this is the first Quaker organization I've ever led as the CEO. And as a boss, sometimes you think you're supposed to know everything. I need to know where this decision needs to be, and then I'm going to steer the group that way and all that. you are convening a group that's going to make a decision, or you are participating in a group that's going to make a decision, but you need to recognize other points of view, other perspectives, and then be listening, deep listening to where is the energy going of the group. It's important to understand that consensus is not necessarily the same as unanimous and unanimity or unity or however we want to say it. When we're talking about consensus, we're talking about we've reached a place, a decision where we feel this is the right direction to go. This is what's right for the we, not necessarily the me. It's been well explored. We've heard all the differences of opinion. We're going to talk in a few minutes about those who may disagree. But that overall, the energy of the group, the decision-making group is yes, this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to move. So, but it doesn't have to be unanimous. And that is one of the myths about collaborative decision-making, is we're just going to keep at this and keep at this and keep at this until everybody agrees. It does not have to be that way. All right. We have a formal process for considering disagreements and moving forward. And for it to succeed, both the conveners and the participants need to understand, how this works and be open-minded about it. There's no winners or losers. If you are someone who, again, is part of a group using this method for decision-making, and if things don't go your way, you're going to feel like you've lost, that everybody else disagreed with me, and you're going to go outside of the meeting and then talk about, well, this is what they decided, but I thought it'd be something different. Again, you are not engaging in this process with the mindset that's necessary. We pay attention to those voices that may bring a different perspective. So we say the minority position here. And it is the responsibility of the convener to look for that and to bring it out. Because you never know where something different occurs to somebody else, or they see it from a different angle, and it turns out to be really valuable. So as a convener, one of your responsibilities is exploring within the group if there's some opinion or perspective that hasn't yet been voiced. And then, as Lee said, implementation often moves much more efficiently. We like to talk about, with consensus decision-making, it's really trading time. You may be putting in a lot of time up front as you're talking it out, as you're hearing all the different opinions, you're sorting through it and reaching consensus, but then implementation goes smoothly. If you think about a decision that comes, from the top down or the outside or whatever, and just gets announced, then all the stuff you're dealing with afterwards. So we say it's just trading time. What collaborative decision-making is not? It is not a discussion group. It's discussion, absolutely, bringing perspectives and opinions and hearing that. But it's not a discussion group, so to speak. It's a process used to reach a decision. It's not an opportunity for somebody to push their agenda. And you come with an open mind and an open heart. It's not, people can't hide behind other people's decisions and not take responsibility. If you are part of that decision-making group and the group makes a decision, then you own it just as much as they do. And if you can't own it, then you maybe should not be part of that group anymore. Because the decision-making group needs to speak with one voice. It's not an opportunity for people to try to hijack the process. So we have this expression called standing aside, we'll talk about, which is when you disagree, you're willing to stand aside. Well, you will hear people say off and on and all that, oh, well, I'm going to stand in the way. No such thing as standing in the way. But that has to do with the misconception that consensus is unanimous. And so there are people who think, well, if I disagree, it can't move forward. No, as the convener, you need to know how you manage that. And there's also a responsibility for the people who are participating to bring their voice into the conversation, and we'll talk about that a little bit more. Trust is absolutely necessary for this to go on. And so things like, not talking out of school, when a decision is made, again, if you don't agree with it or you do agree with it, you're not outside of that meeting saying, well, you're never going to believe what Felicia said during this meeting. Because Felicia's going to find out, and then she's not, going to feel safe in opening her mouth the next time. So confidentiality is important, and trusting that this is a group that understands it was a thoughtfully led process, and we're going to move forward together. All right, a couple more requirements, but key, being clear about what's being decided. Sometimes, and especially if you get into some meaty discussions, it's like, well, wait a minute, what is it we're deciding here? So whether you have a written agenda for the meeting or you're talking about it, but one of the roles of you as the convener is making sure it's very clear, what is the decision we're making here? What are we deciding? The participants need to be teachable. We've talked about open-minded, open heart. We're going to talk about speak and release in a minute, and standing aside. I think we've covered all these, but again, good preparation on the part of everybody. And we'll get into that a little bit more. So where my little cursor moves, and then, okay. So I understand the term you're using for your committee chairs, clerks, is convener. So let's just say this says role of convener. Again, those terms are interchangeable in how we're talking about this. You're the conductor of the process. It is your role to make sure that you're keeping the people who are part of the decision-making group focused on the decision at hand. We all know how easy it is to start going down rabbit holes and talking about all different things. But if you're there to make a decision, let's keep it focused on that. Encouraging the participants to contribute their voice. They're part of that decision-making group for a reason. And so encouraging them to say and share what they're thinking is important. Within every group, there's often introverts and extroverts. And so thinking about what's the best way you're going to get all those voices into the conversation. So depending on the size of your decision-making group, your committee or task force, maybe you want to divide into small groups, for 15 minutes and talk in small groups about what people are thinking, and then share it with the larger group. Or even just have people pair up and discuss it, and then share with another pair and then talk. But you want to think of what techniques you can use to get those voices into the conversation. Because you want that full range of perspectives. When we think about once a decision's made, we want to make sure people have been heard, and we've considered all these different points of view. So we need to bring them out during the process. As the convener, then as you're going through and you're hearing from the people who are part of the decision-making process, one of your major roles then is to state where you think we may be getting close to consensus or have reached consensus. So you want to state that, say it, and then you test it with the group. So, if I'm convening a meeting and we're talking about different points of view about a decision, but there seems to be people starting to coalesce around something, I might say, colleagues, my sense is that we feel it is important that we approve this, and blah, blah, blah. Is that right? So you state what you think is the consensus or where the group is moving, and then check in. And we'll talk about what possible responses there might be from participants, but that's one of your major roles as convener. What you are not doing is you are not an influencer. You are not trying to persuade people to your point of view or how you want things to go. You're not trying to wrangle people agree with what I have to say because this is going to be better. You are the conductor of the process. So very often, 9 times out of 10, the best way for a convener to do this is you don't state what your opinion is. You're listening for what's coming from the other people in the decision-making group. And chances are somebody else is going to say what you're thinking anyway. And we'll talk in a minute about what you can do otherwise. But your job is to lead this process. It is not to lead to the outcome. All right. So some of the things you may want to do, especially if you have a larger group or especially if things are getting a little stirred up, ask participants to be recognized before they speak. So if I'm chairing a meeting that's, more than about 4 people, 5 people, I'll ask people to raise their hand if they have something to say. And so then I can call them in. I can kind of keep things orderly. You also want to encourage people speak to the chair, not to each other. So if a issue starts to get a little heated and there's differing opinions, it can be really easy to start this one-on-one back and forth with each other and counterpoint type things. That's not what we're looking for. We want to hear both points of view, so reminding people to speak to the chair so that the whole group hears it. Again, if you're asking folks to raise their hand, or even if they're not, letting everybody who has something to say speak once before somebody else speaks a second time. And that can be hard, especially if somebody's feeling pretty wound up about something, but you need to manage that. So again, the raising of the hands, and I will acknowledge that I see your hand, I see your hands up again, Mary, but let's hear from some other folks and I'll be back. And I literally sit there with a piece of paper and write names down so I don't miss them. Or if somebody just starts to speak, they don't raise their hand, they're feeling, so vigorous about it that they just starts talking, I'll stop them. I'll just say, hang on, Mary, we want to hear from you again, but we're gonna hear what other folks have to say first. So you need to manage that process as the convener. Be willing to interrupt people who are belaboring a point. If they're going on and on and on, just, interrupt and say, I think we know where you stand, appreciate that. Let's make sure we're hearing from everybody else. Or if there's, if they're, again, beating the same drum over and over. I hear you, John. I apologize if there's anybody in here named John. I hear you, John. I think we know where you stand. Do you have anything new that you want to add? Instead of just saying the same thing over and over again. Another technique, if it starts to get pretty heated, is you just pause. And you just say, can everyone just put their hands down for a minute and let's just take a moment here. And you just have silence for a minute or two and let everybody calm down. So I said yesterday when I was talking to the group, you never say, okay, calm down here, folks. That just, fires them up even more. But just say, can everyone put their hands down for a minute? And let's just, just take a moment of silence here. And then you say, okay, who has something to say? Very often the same hands will go up again, but sometimes people just in that minute or two realize, I don't need to offer what I have to say. Another special technique is you want to make sure your voice is in the room, but if somebody else says the same thing, or maybe not using the exact same words, but the essence of their message is the same, it's important for the convener to know where you stand, but you also want to recognize time constraints, and we don't need to hear it in Janie's when Lee said essentially the same thing. So you can just say, I agree with Lee, or Lee speaks my mind, or something like that. So the convener knows where you are, but you don't need to add anything more than that. All right, if you are the convener and you have a strong opinion, so a few minutes ago I was saying as the convener, you should not be putting your opinion out there. You certainly don't start the meeting with that. If you feel very strongly about an issue, you can ask somebody else to manage that part of the meeting so that you can just be a participant. You're not the leader. That's one way to do it. Another is, and again, as I said, often somebody else will say what you're thinking. So you want to give it time. Give a chance for your point of view to just come out of somebody else's mouth who's thinking the same thing. But if if that hasn't happened, and you feel you do have something important to add to the conversation, and you haven't had anybody else, run that decision piece, then what you can do is say, I have something I'd like to add here, but I'm not saying this as the convener. I'm just saying this as a member of the group. So you're separating, okay, I'm not the convener and I'm trying to get everybody to follow me. This is just Jane's opinion. And you offer that and then come back. But if there's something that you feel very strongly about, then you should not be leading that particular decision-making process. So whether it's somebody else does it for that piece of the meeting or they do the whole meeting, whatever. But I actually, within a monthly meeting, so that's what we call a place where we go to worship on Sundays is our monthly meeting. I witnessed a process that the person leading the decision-making process had a very strong point of view. And it was just so wrong. It was just so wrong. And really was hard to watch. I wasn't part of the decision-making group, so I did not offer anything, but it was just wrong. So just think about that. If you're feeling it, you may not be the one to lead that particular decision process. All right, role of participants. If you give me 1 second, I'm just going to go drink water. Come prepared. If you're in a group that's making a decision, undoubtedly, you've probably had preparation work, you've discussed it before, you may get materials in advance to read. But if there's something that you should be doing to prepare for being part of this decision discussion, do it. If you've agreed to be part of this group, then you have responsibilities. You need to be open to this process. Again, open mind, open heart, be teachable. Make sure you acknowledge other people's point of views. You may not agree with it, but respect it and honor it and acknowledge it. And someone asked me yesterday, well, how do you do that? And that's really hard to quantify. A lot of it is nonverbal, and so especially if we're doing it virtually, then it's really hard. But if you're sitting there when somebody else is talking and they're expressing something that's different than how you think, and you've got your arms crossed, and you have a bit of a sneer on your face, and you're rolling your eyes, you're shaking your head, any of those different things that indicates you're not really open to hearing what they have to say. So if you agree to be part of a group that makes decisions in this way, then you need to acknowledge other points of view and be open to hearing them. Subject matter experts. Within almost every group, there's often somebody who knows more about the topic than other people, and recognize that. It doesn't mean you have to do what they want, but they probably have something important to add to the conversation. So respect that. We're talking about committees here, right? The conveners of committees mostly.
And we have a residence council.
And then you have a residence council, and so then the committee feeds up to the resident council, not necessarily.
Residence council mostly deals with things that don't fit anywhere else.
Okay. So, I have this line about respecting committee work. So that's if there's any kind of group, like a task force that is a subcommittee, part of a committee. If there's some smaller group that's doing the groundwork, the nitty-gritty, and then they're bringing recommendations to the committee or whatever, respect that. And if you don't, what you don't want is a meeting that devolves into, we're gonna do all the discussion all over again. And then be willing to speak and release. We'll talk about that technique in a minute, and trust that you have been heard. Heard and understood. It doesn't mean you're agreed with, and yet it's so important that we think about that distinction. There's a distinction between being heard and being agreed with. All right. This is kind of the same type of thing about, encourage a complete exploration of an issue. Even if you're not the convener and you know somebody else who's part of that decision-making group has a different point of view and they're not speaking up, encourage them to. It might be saying, Lee, the other day when we were talking, you said something about XYZ. Can you tell me again what it was you were thinking? So just because you're not the convener doesn't mean you can't encourage the voices to be part of the process. We emphasize here about that fourth bullet down through, you have responsibilities and opportunities. You don't have rights. So you don't have the right to filibuster. You don't have the right to be disrespectful or disregard somebody else's opinion because it differs from your own. You have responsibilities to contribute your perspective, to be open to others, and to honor the process. We talk here about no parking lot conversations. That can be really difficult. What we're saying, the parking lot conversation is after the meeting's over, you go out and you're like, can you believe what she said? Or, they didn't talk about this, and I think this is a really important aspect. I don't know why anybody isn't considering it. You say that in the room, in the meeting. That's what this process is about, is that thorough exploration of all the different aspects and perspectives on things. And be patient. It does take longer if we do this right. But done right and done well, it is amazing. All right, speak and release. So this means, in this process, once you have offered your thoughts, your perspective to the group, they belong to the group. So you speak and release, you let it go. You have shared it with the other members of this decision-making body. And the way that I often talk about it is, think about if the decision-making body is all sitting in a circle or in a square, and in the middle of that there's a table. And so as everybody is offering their thoughts and perspective, it goes on the table, and then that grows and grows with each person's thinking. And it is that accumulated mass of thought and perspective on which we're going to base the decision. But you as an individual offer your thoughts, your perspectives, and it then belongs to the group. That is really hard. It is something very different than we see so often today. But it's one of the things that helps this to work. So I talked earlier about you don't wear your opinion like it's an article of clothing and you're unwilling to take it off. You offer your thoughts to the group, and then they belong to the group. That's speak and release. If you are not present for the meeting where the decision is made, but you are normally part of the decision-making group, a couple of things. And we can't all make every single meeting that we're supposed to. It's just not possible. If you know all the background, you know what the decision point is, you can share your thoughts with the convener before the meeting, so they know where you stand. So I'll often, if I'm not going to be in a meeting and I've got the materials and I read them, I'll send a quick email to the convener and say, sorry I can't attend, I read all the materials, I just have this one question. or my thoughts, or blah, blah, blah. But I always end it with, I trust the process and the wisdom of the group. Because I recognize that I am not going to be there, and I can't expect them to hold up a decision because I'm not there. I offer what I have, if I have an opinion, but it's then the group that's there to decide. And then if you can't be there, speak to the convener afterwards to understand what the decision was and to support it, because everybody owns it. I always write show up next time. More as a joke than anything. But here's another one that's really important. If you are there for the decision-making meeting, but you have not been there for previous meetings that led up to this decision, it is not appropriate for you to question everything that's been done to this point or to try to hold it up, because you have not been fully engaged in the process. And you need to trust that those people that have are going to make the right decision. I see that happen way too many times, that people who haven't been there for the preparation meeting, or even worse, they've been there, but they haven't really been listening, and they haven't read the materials that came in advance or whatever. And then we get to this decision point, and they're like, well, wait a minute, what about X, Y, Z? So you as conveners need to say, Mary, we've been through this. We talked about it the last couple meetings. I'm sorry you couldn't be with us, but we are ready to reach, we are ready to move to a decision. Can't let that hold up the process, and you as an engaged participant in it should not try to. So if you can't be there, try in whatever way you can to meet your responsibilities. But one of those responsibilities is you own the decision the group makes afterwards, even if you were not there, and you need to support it. How you arrive at consensus. Well, this is talk about an art and a science and all that, but that's basically as the convener or even any other member of their group, you kind of feel like, all right, we've gotten to this place where there seems to be agreement around something. And so, again, the convener will say, my sense is that we've reached consensus around X, Y, Z, or, my feels to me like we're ready to say yes to this decision. Am I reading that right? Do say something that you check it with the group. And then I don't know if you keep minutes or not of your different committee meetings, but you record what the decision is. The bottom point there, in all cases, once consensus is reached, everybody owns it. And I know I've said it time and time again, but that is so important. All right, how you as a participant, how might you respond to proposal, somebody, the convener says what they think is consensus. I agree. If you're in person, you can nod your head, I approve. If you're on Zoom or Teams, they've got those little emoticons or whatever you call it, that you can use, put your thumb up or whatever it is to indicate you agree. If you don't agree, you might say, I'm not clear. If you think maybe there is some consensus around something a little bit different, you can say that. You'd say, I think maybe we reached consensus, but I would articulate it a little bit differently than you did, and then say what that is, and the group can massage it and see where people are all coalescing. I think we need more information. I don't think we're ready to make a decision. All of those are different ways that you may react to when your convener says, here's my sense of what we've reached. If you are the one, if you're not agreeing with consensus, if you're not agreeing with what's being stated and where people, the mass of the group seems to be going, a couple of good reflection questions for you. Making sure that you are thinking about what is good for the group, not what my personal opinion is or what's good for me. making sure you have voiced your perspective. Why is it you don't agree? It is important for the decision-making group to know why you don't agree, because there may be some little piece of something in there that they haven't considered, and it's important to think about. So have I voiced my perspective and been heard even though not agreed with? Again, that distinction between being heard and being agreed with. Have I made a really good faith effort to understand the point of others? And have I thought about alternate solutions? It may not be where they're saying they seem to be going. It may not be exactly what I'm thinking, but is there a third way? Is there something different here that we haven't thought about? So all of those are thoughts. If you're not feeling that you are exactly aligned with what's being considered, then these reflection questions can be good. All right, the process of standing aside. So this is when the group appears to be reaching consensus, but you don't agree with it. And it's not just some nuanced things. I guess it could be nuanced things, but you really don't agree with it. But yet, you can see this is clearly where the energy of the group has gone. But you're not feeling it. You understand, the process has been used correctly. You have had a chance to share what you're thinking and why you don't agree with it, and you feel you have been heard. Then there is this process we call standing aside. So when the convener says, all right, colleagues, I feel like we've reached consensus about X, Y, Z, and most of the group, all the group except you is saying yes, yes, nodding their heads or whatever. You as someone who doesn't agree have an obligation to say, I don't agree, but I will. Now you don't have an obligation to say I'm standing aside. If you feel you have been heard, if you feel the process has been good, but there's clearly the energy of the group has gone here, you can say to that consensus, I do not agree, but I'm willing to stand aside. And what that is saying is I recognize that this is really where the group has coalesced. I'm not there with them, but I respect the process, I respect what's been done, and that this is how the group feels this is the best decision. So I am willing to stand aside, it's called. If someone does not agree and they don't offer to stand aside, the convener can ask them to stand aside. So if I know that Phantom John, wherever you are, who I'm picking on here in this room, does not agree with what we've been doing and the direction we've been going, and I state what I think the consensus is, and everybody's like, yes, 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 but John is like, no. But John doesn't say, but I'm willing to stand aside. I, as the convener, can say, John, I understand you're not in agreement. Are you willing to stand aside? So I can ask him, I can invite him to stand aside. And even if he doesn't, so if you have people or person who willingly stands aside, or when they are invited to stand aside, does not, it is still the decision of the group whether you are going to move forward. And I cannot emphasize this enough, because this is where so many people think, oh, we have to stop. We've got two people who don't agree with us, we have to stop. It is the decision of the group. So then my job as convener is to say, okay, folks, we have consensus around XYZ. We have two among us who are not in agreement and who do not wish to stand aside. Do we still want to move ahead? And it is the decision of the group whether we're going to move ahead or not. Now, it's important that you think about, if you are a group of 5 and you've got 2 people who are in disagreement, you haven't reached consensus. Okay? But if you're a group of 20 and you have 2 people who are in disagreement, then you may want to think about moving forward. So there's no specific chart that says how many people for what size group. This is the art and the science of it all. But it does not have to hold you up when there are people who don't agree. So they can offer to stand aside, they can be invited to stand aside, and whether they do or not, you as convener, still, the decision belongs with the group. If you're keeping minutes of an organization, of a meeting, excuse me, it was funny because Lee and I have different experiences with this. So my experience has always been, we would record that we made a decision and 2 people chose to stand aside. We did not put names, we did not put reasons. We would just say, 2 people chose to stand aside. Lee told me yesterday, so her experience is they can be recorded, both their names and the reasons that they stood aside. So, different practices, different ways. But it is important that the minutes would say, at a minimum, the group decided to move ahead, we had 2 people stand aside. At a minimum, you want to say that. Do you have a question, Felicia?
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
All right. What if consensus is not reached, and this is only if it's not time critical? In an organization like Kendall at Lexington, you have a lot of time critical decisions. So, can it go back to a subgroup? Can you talk about it more at your next meeting? What is it? Do we need to have some one-on-one conversations or small group conversations? So thinking about that. Or there's what's called a threshing session, or as a kid I called this a thrashing session. And that is when you have a meeting and all it is to talk. No decisions to be made, but just to make sure we bring out all the issues. All right, there's lots of reasons this can go off the rails. This is not, it's not a easy process. It's not a 1, 2, 3, okay, I read the manual, I can do it. It's a challenge. But if you really think about it, if people have the right mindset, if you as the convener, excuse me, if the convener and the participants understand their roles and responsibilities, it can be a beautiful, beautiful process. All right, so this was kind of a summary. It would be same thing. Main points I would talk about are there are specific roles and responsibilities for the convener and for the participants. If you are part of a decision-making process or decision-making group, you are not there to warm the seat. You are there to bring your voice into the discussion. You need to be open-minded and teachable. You need to recognize that it may take some time. Understand about speak and release, sharing what your thoughts are, and then they belong to the group. Understanding the standing aside piece, that it doesn't have to be unanimous. Those are the main things, and you need to own the decision, even if it's not your personal preference, if you're part of that decision-making group. All right, that was whipping through some slides pretty quickly, and I see it's 5 of 11, but I'm happy to answer questions if there are any, or comments, or I imagine there may be people in here who've led this process before.
Is there any concept of having a quorum in order to reach a consensus?
No.
Repeat the question?
Okay, yeah, the question is there any concept of having a quorum in order to reach consensus? No, because I would say consensus, a quorum is often a majority, so if you have a group of 20, you have to have 11 people to have a quorum. 11 out of 20 feeling one way is not consensus.
My question is more to bring up, if you don't have enough members of the group, is it acceptable to try to come to a consensus on that smaller part of the group?
I gotcha. A couple things I would say, it depends, if it's a group that has specific bylaws or anything, then you want to refer to that. But if it's something meaty, no, you want most of the people there. If it's time sensitive, you may not have a choice. But I would say, let's say you have a committee of 12 and you've only got half who show up for a meeting. Yeah, you may reach consensus among half, but that's not necessarily consensus of the full group. I don't know if other people think of it that way because, but if you have only half who show up meeting after meeting after meeting, then those are participants in that decision-making group who are not meeting their responsibilities. So there's a lot of sides to that. That's, I wish that were an easier question, but my mind is going all over the place with things.
One of my biggest concerns here at Kendall at Lexington is that when we chose to come, we were not joining an organization like I become a member of the Society of Friends. So there has not been a buy-in on the process. And it's easy for me to imagine there are a goodly number of people on our campus who won't stand aside, who won't let go of something. And it distresses me that I don't see how Kendall at Lexington can actually perform this process.
I hear what you're saying. I certainly have a lot of thoughts. But one of them is it the general practice of Kendall at Lexington that this is how decisions are made? And I'm seeing a nodding of heads. And so if you've chosen to move into a community that this is how decisions are made, then you have chosen to move to a community if this is how decisions are made. And if you don't like the process, you've got a choice. You can join in and be part of the process, or be a disruptor and unfortunately then make it challenging. I don't want to say too much. I think I would leave it for Jan or someone else to answer that. And that goes on everywhere. It's not just a Kendall at Lexington. But if it's clearly understood, this is how we make decisions, and you're very clear about who's the decision maker, here's the process where you can bring your voice into it, where we're asking for input, where we're telling you, how we're moving along with something, then hopefully but we always emphasize this is a community, and it's a community in a philosophical sense, not just a geographical sense. And so it's about the we, not the me. Yeah.
You've gone through the process, you've reached what you think is a consensus, and of course, as you've indicated, that gets translated in many cases into minutes. What do you do in terms of dealing with what's almost an inevitability that somebody's going to look at the minutes and say, well, that isn't quite what I thought we reached consensus on. Do you have a secondary process of getting input and go back? Is there a loop back here, or what do you do?
No, there's not a loop back. I would say, so for minutes, and I don't know what your process is for minutes for committees.
We have them.
And does somebody just write them and then they're published, or does somebody write them and somebody else looks at them before they're published?
My experience is they're supposed to be circulated to the committee to approve.
Okay.
Yeah, that's normally what it would be, but let's say you got two members of the committee and said, I participated, I was part of that consensus building process, I agreed with what I heard, but that's not exactly what it says in the minutes now.
So I would say, and I've been part of groups like that, so I then respond to the full committee saying, I've read the minutes, I was at the meeting, I see this is how it's stated, I saw things a little differently. But you want to do that before they become public. This is when they're still in draft form among the committee. So that's how I've handled it in the past. And so suggest maybe what was a little different. And so then if hopefully other members of the committee are going to engage in that discussion, you're going to get to a good place. Hopefully. If there's an impasse, then it's probably time for the committee to come back together and talk about it. Yeah.
That's just what points was be teachable.
Yes.
And would you say that you or Quakers believe in that all people are teachable?
Can you repeat that too?
Yeah, the question was, so I talked about it's important for people to be teachable. You said, do you or do all Quakers believe everyone is teachable? I'm going to tell you that my now 31-year-old son, when he was about 7, wasn't he? So first of all, one thing as a Quaker, you never answer for the whole Society of Friends, because it's a very individualized. Jane, do I think everyone is teachable? No. But I think if you are in a setting where this is how decisions are made, that this is a community, so whether it's an organization, whether it's a civic group, whether it's a retirement community, if you are going to be part of that organization and you're going to be, then you're accepting this is how decisions are made. And if I'm going to be part of a decision-making group, then I have to be teachable. I have to be willing to hear other points of view, and I have to be willing to change my mind. I may not, but I need to be open to that possibility. But that's just Jane's opinion. Yeah.
On 2 points. The point about the minutes, the board does it differently from the Residents Association. So we have 2 types of processes here. The board has minutes. The minutes are circulated to all members of the board, and one of the agenda items on the next meeting is approval of the minutes. And frequently, the minutes get amended or modified based on the recollections of those at that follow-up meeting. There are minutes here, and I guess they go by email to everybody, but I don't think there's ever a discussion about them at a following meeting. The other issue is consensus. Consensus, when I chaired the board for 6 years, back in 2008 to 2014. And I had input going into that job that consensus required unanimity. I did not think that made sense because it gave to any one member of the group veto power over anything you wanted to do, and I just didn't think that was proper. I prepared, before I really started, a one-page paper called My Approach to Chairing the Board, in which I set out for the other board members what I thought about the way the board ought to operate with me as chair. And the last paragraph of that dealt with the question of consensus. If you Google consensus, as I did back then and I did just recently, you have so many definitions of consensus that conflict with each other that you don't get any guidance. Everything from majority to unanimity. Now, those are 2 totally different concepts. You can't do both. My dictionary, which I trust a lot, has 2 definitions of consensus. The first one is majority of opinion. And the second one, which I believe is the correct one, is general agreement. A general agreement, and I told the board in this that it did not require unanimity and it was not a simple majority. So you have to have something more than that, and I think Jane has explained that. 2 dissenting out of 5 does not leave you with consensus, but 18 out of 20 probably does. And I said in my paper here that I, as chair, would determine the consensus, but I would tell the board what the consensus was, and of course, if anybody had questions about it, they can always raise that or ask it to be modified in some way. If you look at consensus on Google, you'll find so many different definitions that you wouldn't know how to apply it in running a meeting.
Thank you. And I think that term general agreement is a good one. Good. Any other questions, comments? Did I confuse you more or make things any clearer? Yes, no. All right. Well, thank you very much for your time and attention.